Sometimes a case starts with a body. This one started with a notebook. The man stood outside the window in the rain, perfectly still, the way only patient men can be still. He wore a dark coat, good wool, and he didn't hunch against the weather the way most men do. He just stood there watching two women inside a lit room laugh at something only they understood. Sisters. The way they moved, the way they tilted their heads at the same angle. You could see it from the street. Twins. He watched for 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small leather notebook. He opened it without looking down, turned to a page near the back, read something, and then, with one slow, deliberate line, he crossed out a name, not frantic, not relieved, just finished, the way a man crosses off a grocery item. He closed the notebook, slid it back into his inside pocket over his heart, turned up his collar, walked into the rain, and was gone before the women inside stopped laughing. I wasn't there for that. I only know it happened because the case told me so, the way cases do, backwards in pieces, never clean. Pryor called me at 6:15 in the morning. I was already awake. I'd been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the sound of the radiator knocking. Old habits from 40 years on the job. Sleep becomes optional eventually, and then it becomes a stranger. The address was on Winthrop, a 3-flat near Argyle. I drove through streets still dark and wet, the city not yet awake enough to pretend it was something other than what it was. My hands were unsteady on the wheel. They'd been doing that more lately. I didn't mention it to anyone. The dead woman's name was Ruth Carey, 34 years old, eldest twin by 11 minutes. She'd been strangled in the kitchen of her 3rd-floor apartment. No sign of forced entry. No obvious motive. The younger sister, Vera, had found her at midnight when Ruth hadn't answered the telephone. Vera was still in the apartment when I arrived, sitting on the hallway floor with her knees pulled up, making a sound that wasn't quite crying, more like breathing that had forgotten its purpose. No witnesses. Nobody in the building had heard anything unusual. I stood over Ruth Carey and noted the stillness of the scene. Too still, too clean. A man who knew what he was doing. I interviewed Vera Carey at the precinct the next afternoon. She'd slept some, which made her look worse. The kind of sleep that doesn't restore, just relocates the grief temporarily. She held a paper cup of coffee she never drank. I asked her about the weeks before, any strangers, anyone paying unusual attention to her or Ruth. She thought about it carefully. That's what I remembered about her. She thought before she spoke. Most people in shock don't bother. There was a man, she said, near the building, maybe 3 times in 2 weeks. I noticed him because he didn't look like he belonged on our street. Not poor enough. He just stood there, watching. I asked her to describe him. She said, calm-looking, well-dressed, a face she couldn't quite hold on to after the fact, the kind of ordinary that becomes invisible. Medium height, dark hair, late 30s maybe. Then she said, he had a scar on his left hand, back of it, between the thumb and forefinger. I noticed when he touched the iron railing out front. I wrote it down. Left hand. The scar. I didn't know yet what it meant. I just wrote it down and underlined it once, the way you do when something pulls at you without explaining why. 8 days later, on a Thursday that smelled like coming winter, I got the second call. Pilsen neighborhood, a narrow house on 18th Street. The victim's name was Margaret Holst, 31 years old, eldest twin by 4 minutes. Same method. Strangled, no forced entry, no struggle to speak of. Her younger sister Dora was alive, hysterical, but alive. I stood in the living room of that house and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the November air. Pryor met me there. He was already talking to a patrolman when I arrived, already looking at his watch the way he did when a case was costing the department more hours than the budget liked. I told him to give me the room. He gave me 5 minutes. Dora Holst, once she could speak, described a man she'd seen twice near their house in the previous weeks. Calm, well-dressed, forgettable face. She couldn't recall the hand. She'd only glimpsed him from the upstairs window. but the description matched Vera Carey's account closely enough that I felt the pieces begin to find each other. 2 families, 2 dead women, both the older twin, both younger sisters left alive. I drove back to the precinct in the rain and didn't turn on the radio. I found Vasquez at his desk with 3 empty coffee cups and a crime map he'd been staring at long enough to memorize. Vasquez was good at the map work, the spatial thinking, the patterns. He could see a city the way chess players see a board, always 3 moves ahead of where they were standing. I pulled a chair up and laid out what I had. Both cases, both victims, the age detail, 11 minutes, 4 minutes, but always the older twin, always the younger left alive, always no witnesses who could hold a detail worth prosecuting. Vasquez listened without interrupting. That was one of his better qualities. When I finished, he said, "Could be coincidence. 2 murders with similar victim profiles." 2 murders in 8 days, I said. Both women, both twins, both the elder, both with a calm, well-dressed stranger seen near the building beforehand. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern with a signature. Vasquez looked at the map. What's he communicating? Someone is specifically choosing twins, I said, and leaving one alive on purpose. That's not random. That's a message. To who? Vasquez said. I didn't have that yet, but it was the right question. It was the question that eventually broke the whole thing open. The 3rd murder came 11 days after the 2nd. A woman named Catherine Pruitt, 40 years old, found in her apartment on Michigan Avenue's less glamorous southern end, eldest twin by 7 minutes. Her younger sister, Louise, lived in Milwaukee and was contacted by telephone. She didn't know anything about a man near the building. She hadn't visited in 3 months. Catherine Pruitt didn't fit the neighborhood of the first 2 victims. She was better off. Her apartment had decent furniture and a telephone of her own. That mattered because it meant this wasn't about geography or class. The killer wasn't hunting in a specific pocket of the city. He was hunting by criteria. I sat with all 3 files spread across my desk and the city noise coming through the window, muffled by rain and distance. Ruth Carey, Margaret Holst, Catherine Pruitt, different neighborhoods, different circumstances, different families, but the same detail 3 times in a row, the older twin, always the older twin. The surviving sisters ranged in age from 31 to 40, but in each pair the victim had entered the world first, minutes first in most cases. I circled that in red pen and wrote beside it, not about age, not about appearance, about order. Something about order was killing these women. Vasquez did what Vasquez was good at. He worked the witness descriptions through every channel available. Patrol contacts, vice records, a retired beat cop named Delaney, who had the kind of memory for faces that the department should have bottled and sold. 3 witnesses, 3 separate incidents, all describing the same general figure, calm, well-dressed, scar on the left hand. Delaney recognized the scar description. He'd arrested a man 6 years ago for assault, a tenant dispute that turned physical, though the landlord had come off considerably worse. The man had a distinctive scar on the back of his left hand, acquired, the arresting report noted, in a childhood accident. His name was Roy Cole. He'd done 60 days in county jail. After that, he'd dropped off the record entirely. No fixed address, no employment, nothing for 3 years. Vasquez brought me the report on a Wednesday evening, setting it on my desk with the careful manner of a man delivering something fragile. Roy Cole, he said, disappeared right around when a certain kind of patience would have finished brewing. I read the file twice. The assault victim had been his landlord, a dispute over conditions in a building Cole had been living in. He'd been calm during the arrest, the report noted, almost indifferent, like the outcome didn't change anything fundamental about his plan. We found Roy Cole in a rooming house on Clark Street, which told me he hadn't been as disappeared as we'd thought, or he'd come back recently for reasons I didn't yet understand. The patrol that picked him up reported he came without protest, didn't ask why, just put on his coat and walked out with them like he'd been expecting the invitation. By the time I got to the interrogation room, he was already seated. He'd chosen the chair facing the door. That's the thing you notice. Some people sit facing the wall, nervous, contained. Cole faced the door. He wanted to see what was coming. He was 38, according to the file. He looked like a man who'd spent those 38 years making very careful decisions. Medium build, dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, a face that was entirely ordinary and entirely unreadable. Good coat, not expensive enough to explain, not cheap enough to dismiss. His hands were folded on the table. I looked at the left one, back of the hand, between thumb and forefinger. A pale scar, maybe an inch long, the skin raised slightly. I sat down across from him. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite interest and wasn't quite boredom, somewhere between the two. The still water that runs deep.
Roy Cole was polite. That was the first thing. Not cooperative. Polite. There's a difference. Cooperative means you want to help. Polite means you've decided to manage the conversation. I asked him about Ruth Carey. He listened to the name with no visible reaction, which itself was a kind of reaction if you knew how to read it. I don't know the name, he said. His voice was flat and even, not the flatness of stupidity, the flatness of discipline. I told him the date and time of her murder. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something to himself. February the 9th, he said. Evening. That's right, I said. I was at the stadium, he said. Heavyweight card. Kowalski and Burns. First bout started at 8. I was in my seat by 7:30. He paused. There were approximately 200 people in that building who saw me. The man at the door remembers me because I gave him $1 over the ticket price for a better seat. Another pause. I can give you names. He gave me 5 names. All of them checked out within 2 hours, 200 witnesses, and $1 tip that the doorman still remembered. Roy Cole had been at that boxing match, definitively, provably, incontrovertibly. I sat with that for a long time after he left.
I let him go. I had no choice. 200 witnesses is not a gap you argue around. Not in 1949, not in any year. Pryor was already making noises about false detention and what that meant for the department's relationship with the alderman on the north side. I let Roy Cole button his coat, thank me for my time with the sincerity of a man who has never needed anyone's time, and walk out through the precinct doors into a Tuesday afternoon that was gray and cold and indifferent. I watched him go from the window above the entrance. He walked south without hurrying, didn't look back. I noticed he kept his hands in his coat pockets, which meant I couldn't see the scar. Vasquez came and stood beside me. Clean alibi, he said. Too clean, I said. That's not how alibi works, Mahoney. You can't be too present somewhere. You can if you plan to be, I said. Vasquez didn't push it. He knew I wasn't letting go, and he knew better than to waste argument on that particular brand of stubbornness. I'd been wearing it for 40 years, and it fit like the charcoal coat. Not comfortable exactly, but mine. I kept watching the street after Cole had disappeared from view. Something about the way he walked, like a man who knows exactly where he's going.
The fourth murder happened on a Friday at 2:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I was sitting 12 feet from Roy Cole when it happened. I'd been following him loosely all week, nothing formal, just eyes on. On Friday, he went to a diner on Wabash called Pearson's, ordered coffee and a piece of pie, and read a newspaper with the patience of a man who has nowhere pressing to be. I took a stool at the counter and ordered coffee. He saw me come in, didn't acknowledge it, just turned a page. My telephone contact came through the diner's payphone at 2:20, the patrol sergeant's voice. Fourth victim found, Bridgeport, strangled, no forced entry, elder twin. I hung up and walked back to my stool. Cole was still at his table, newspaper open, coffee half full, pie plate clean. He looked up from the paper then, and the timing of it, the precise, almost staged timing, told me he'd been waiting for this moment. "Seems you have somewhere to be, Detective," he said, not surprised, not curious, just noting a fact. I stared at him for what felt like a long time. The coffee cup was warm in my hand. My other hand, the one I put on the counter for balance, was shaking.
The fourth victim was Adeline Cross, 46 years old, Bridgeport, elder twin by 9 minutes. Younger sister Harriet had been at work, came home to find Adeline in the sitting room. Same method, same absence of struggle, same clean, deliberate execution. Roy Cole had been in that diner for 2 hours before the estimated time of death. The counterman confirmed it. 2 other customers confirmed it. He'd paid his check, left a reasonable tip, and walked out of Pearson's only after I'd already gone. I drove back to the precinct through traffic that seemed deliberately slow, and I sat at my desk for 20 minutes without writing anything. 4 victims, the same man seen in the vicinity before each murder, the same method, the same selection criteria, and the primary suspect with ironclad alibis for at least 2 of the 4 killings, possibly all 4. We were still checking the timeline for murders 2 and 3. I was a detective with 40 years on the job, and I had no rational explanation for what I was looking at. Roy Cole could not be in 2 places at once, except the evidence suggested he was, or something that looked exactly like Roy Cole was. I stared at that thought for a while. Then I wrote it down, because writing things down makes them real, and real things can be worse. Vasquez brought me a sandwich I didn't eat and a theory I didn't want to hear. "What if he's not working alone?" he said. I looked up from the files. Roy Cole has no known associates, no friends in the record, no family we found, no criminal relationships. He's been essentially invisible for 3 years. "Invisible doesn't mean alone," Vasquez said. "It means careful. You're suggesting a partner who looks enough like him that witnesses can't distinguish them." "I'm suggesting it's possible," Vasquez said. I shook my head. Not because he was wrong, I didn't know yet if he was wrong, but because the theory felt too convenient. A partner who witnesses mistake for Cole and vice versa. How do you find someone invisible by design, and what ties them together strongly enough for this kind of commitment? "What's the motive?" I said. "If it's 2 people, what makes 2 separate people this careful about the same specific target type?" Vasquez didn't have an answer. I didn't have one either. I dismissed the theory and went back to the files. Later, I would think about that conversation and understand how close Vasquez had come and how wrong the framing was. Not a partner. Something older. Something that explained everything if you had the key. The 5th murder came before I'd resolved anything about the 4th. A woman named Patricia Dunn, Lakeview, strangled, elder twin by 12 minutes. I went through the scene with the careful attention of a man who knows he's missing something and is determined to find it before the missing thing finds someone else. That evening I went back to my desk and read every witness statement from all 5 cases. Every single one. I read them slowly, which is harder than it sounds when you're tired and the city is loud outside and your hands won't be still. I was halfway through the 4th file when I stopped. Vera Carey, first case, scene 3 of my notebook, had described a scar on the man's left hand. A witness from the 4th case, a neighbor who'd seen the man outside the Cross building on Bridgeport, had noted a scar on the right hand. I went through the rest. Left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand. Not inconsistent witnesses, not failing memories. The same scar described with similar specificity, back of the hand between thumb and forefinger, appearing on 2 different hands. I sat very still. My unsteady hands went quiet for the first time in weeks. When the body stops shaking, it usually means the mind has taken over completely. Same scar, different hand, mirror image. I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep and I had a complicated relationship. But that night was different. It wasn't the familiar restlessness of a man who has seen too much and closes his eyes onto it. It was the specific wakefulness of a problem unsolved, pacing its room. I went to the office at 2 a.m. The night desk officer gave me a look that I didn't acknowledge. I made coffee and spread the files again on the large table in the back room, the one we used for evidence review when a case grew beyond a single desk. I paced. I am not a pacer by preference. It feels theatrical. But that night I paced, because the movement helped the thinking, and the thinking needed all the help it could get. Same scar, different hand. The witnesses weren't confused. They were accurate. Each of them had seen what they'd seen, a scar, a specific scar, in a consistent location, but mirrored. I thought about mirrors, what a mirror does, not a copy, a reflection. The left becomes the right becomes the left, everything identical and everything reversed. I stopped pacing and stood in the middle of that room for a full minute. Then I thought about twins. What identical twins are, at the biological level. What a mirror image means when it's made of flesh and bone. Pryor called me into his office the next morning. He had the kind of morning face that meant a conversation had already happened above his level, and he was now required to have a version of it with me. He laid it out plainly, which I respected even when I disagreed with the conclusion. Circumstantial evidence against Roy Cole was accumulating. He'd been seen near 2 of the crime scenes. His prior assault conviction involved a landlord, a property dispute. The victims were all connected to property families in the South Side. The department was under pressure to close the case. "Arrest Cole," Pryor said. "Let the courts work it out. He has verified alibis for at least 2 murders," I said, "possibly all 5. Alibis can be managed by good lawyers. I'm not talking about lawyers. I'm talking about 200 people at a boxing match." Pryor looked at me with the patience of a man who has been a captain long enough to understand that patience is not the same as agreement. "Something doesn't fit," I said. "I'm not closing it wrong. You have 72 hours before this goes to the DA's office regardless," Pryor said. "That's not a threat. That's the calendar." I nodded, stood, buttoned the charcoal coat. 72 hours and a theory I hadn't yet finished building. I went home that evening. This was not as common as it should have been, and Eleanor noticed without remarking on it, which was its own kind of remark. She'd made something with potatoes and leftover chicken. We ate at the kitchen table with the radio on low, not talking much, which was not the same as having nothing to say. After dinner, she mentioned she'd been to the market on Division Street that afternoon. She said it the way she said most things lately, carefully, like she was testing the air temperature. "There were twins at the market," she said, "a boy and a girl, maybe 7 years old, identical little faces. One started a sentence and the other one finished it. They didn't even pause, like they share one thought between 2 bodies." She was smiling at the memory. Eleanor's smile, when it came, still did something to the room. I put my fork down. She noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking about a case." She didn't push it. She knew the look. But what she'd said, one thought between 2 bodies, turned a key in something I'd been trying to open for 2 days. Not a partner, not an accomplice, something else, a shared architecture, one plan running through 2 identical machines while I'd been looking for a single man. Roy Cole's rooming house on Clark Street confirmed what I expected when I arrived the next morning. He was gone. The landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Hirsch, who had the detached hospitality of someone who rents rooms for income rather than company, said he'd paid through the end of the month and left his key on the hallway table at some point during the night. She hadn't heard him go. His room was spare, the bed made to a standard that suggested military habit. A few things left behind that meant nothing: a razor, a glass, a damp towel on the rail. Everything personal had been taken. Whatever Roy Cole was, he was tidy. I searched the room methodically, the way 40 years teaches you. Every surface, every drawer, every plank and seam. Under the bed, nothing. Behind the radiator, nothing. Closet shelf, nothing. Then the floor. The boards near the window had a give to them that the others didn't. I knelt down, which took longer than it used to, and worked the loose plank up with my pocket knife. Underneath, a single photograph, face down. Small, sepia-edged, the paper slightly damp at the corner. I picked it up and looked at it face down for a moment, the back plain and blank, before I turned it over. 2 boys, identical, maybe 6 years old, though it's difficult with children. They all carry that same mixture of completeness and unfinished business that makes them ageless in photographs. They were standing in front of a building that had the institutional look of a place designed to house children without room for sentiment. Identical dark eyes, identical set of the jaw, small identical hands at their sides. They weren't touching each other. That's what I noticed first. Most children that age, you put them side by side for a photograph, they lean in. These two stood separate, each perfectly upright, like they'd already learned some lesson about the reliability of closeness. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink that had aged from black to a brownish gray, Roy and Frank. St. Catherine's Home, 1921. Frank. I sat on the floor of Roy Cole's vacated room with a photograph of two boys and a name I hadn't known 20 seconds ago, and I let the geometry of the last 3 weeks rearrange itself around this new fixed point. Roy and Frank, mirror twins, one scar left hand, one scar right hand, one at a boxing match while the other worked, one in a diner across from a detective while the other moved through Bridgeport. I sat still for a long moment. The investigation had just doubled. St. Catherine's Home for Children on the Northwest Side had been operating since 1907, which meant they had records going back far enough to bury a truth that someone had decided didn't need exhuming. The administrator was a brisk woman named Sister Margaret, who looked at my badge with the resigned recognition of someone who deals with civic authority often enough to have opinions about it. The records on Roy and Frank Cole confirmed the photograph. Admitted together, 1921, age 6. Parents deceased. Their mother had died of fever, no father listed. The twins had been at St. Catherine's for approximately 8 months before an adoption committee convened. I read the committee's notation with the particular feeling of a man reading a document that explains a great deal and excuses nothing. Twins are harder to place together. Families prefer single-child adoptions. Committee recommends separate placements when possible to increase each child's chances of successful adoption. 3 families sat on that committee. Each of those 3 families had twins of their own. The committee member a kind of vetting credential, one imagined. Each family took custody of one of 3 sets of twins who were separated that year. Roy Cole went to one family. Frank Cole, under a different surname now, the adopted name, went to another. At age 6, they became strangers by administrative decision. I wrote down the 3 committee family names and drove back to the precinct in silence. Back at my desk with the 3 committee names and 5 victim files, I did the cross-referencing work that is the least romantic part of detective work and among the most important. You lay the facts against each other and let them talk. The conversation is usually quiet and conclusive. Ruth Carey. Her mother had been on the periphery of one committee family, a cousin by marriage to one of the 3 families who sat on the St. Catherine's Committee in 1921. Margaret Holst. Her father had worked for a second committee family, a property management firm on the South Side, for 22 years, close enough to be considered extended circle. Catherine Pruitt. Direct family connection. Her uncle had sat on the committee himself. Adeline Cross, Patricia Dunn. Similar radiating connections. Not all blood, some professional, some social, the kind of adjacency that bound families together in the city's particular way of knowing each other. All 5 victims, all connected, some closely, some at 2 removes. To the 3 families who sat on that adoption committee in 1921 and decided that a 6-year-old boy named Roy and a 6-year-old boy named Frank should be distributed to separate households like items from an estate. The Cole brothers weren't killing at random. They weren't even killing the decision-makers exactly. They were dismantling a family tree, methodically, the older twin of each family, mirror of what had been done to them. I pulled Roy Cole's original arrest record from 1943 and read the physical description with new attention. The scar was documented specifically. Irregular scar, back of left hand, between first finger and thumb, approximately 1 inch, result of childhood laceration. A childhood laceration, something that happened at age 6 or before, when the twins were still together, an identical wound that healed on each boy's hand, and because identical mirror twins develop in opposition, one the physical reflection of the other. Roy's scar sat on his left hand and Frank's sat on his right. Not two men with similar scars. One event, two boys, one wound each, in the mirrored position that genetics had assigned them. I thought about how many witnesses I'd interviewed. How many of them had seen a man with a scar and noted the hand? Half the description said left, half said right, and I had assumed witness error, people misremembering, the common fallibility of observation. Instead, every single witness had been accurate. They had each seen what was in front of them. I had just been looking for one man. While Roy sat at a boxing match, Frank killed Ruth Carey. While Roy ate pie 12 feet from my elbow, Frank strangled Adeline Cross in Bridgeport. Each alibi airtight. Each alibi a performance choreographed by two men who had spent 15 years finding each other and then building this. I thought about the notebook from the cold open. The leather notebook the man at the window had crossed a name from with one slow, deliberate line. I understood it now. Not a list of intended victims. A list of names being systematically eliminated. The committee families and their extended connections, each elder twin crossed off as the work progressed. I pulled the victim count. 5 murders. 5 names crossed off a list that I estimated, based on the 3 committee families and their traceable extended circles, had perhaps 8 or 9 names total. They were almost at the end. I spent 40 minutes tracing the remaining family connections, working forward from the committee records and the extended circles I'd already mapped. Most of the committee members were dead. 1921 was 28 years ago, and the men who'd sat on that committee would be elderly now if they'd survived at all. But one hadn't died. An elderly woman named Gertrude Amann, 81 years old, living in a coach house in Hyde Park. She'd been the administrative secretary for the adoption committee. She'd prepared the paperwork that separated Roy and Frank Cole. She was the last living member of the original committee with a traceable twin connection in her extended family. I felt the urgency arrive like a change in air pressure. They knew. They were working the list. They knew she was there. Vasquez found Frank Cole in the orphanage records within an hour of me showing him the photograph and explaining what I'd built. He was good in a crisis. He didn't waste time with the kind of disbelief that slows men down. He just went to work. Frank Cole had been adopted under the surname Morrow. He'd lived as Frank Morrow in the Englewood neighborhood for most of his adult life, working in a dry goods warehouse until 3 years ago. Around the same time, Roy had gone invisible. The address in Englewood was probably 3 years out of date, but it was a thread. Through the Englewood address, we found a former neighbor who'd kept a Christmas card list. She had a forwarding address, a rooming house in Bridgeport, 2 miles from the Cross murder scene. Vasquez looked at me over the phone records. Bridgeport, he said. He was close enough to walk, I said. We had Gertrude Amann's address in Hyde Park and Frank Morrow Cole's last known address in Bridgeport, and a diminishing window of time between 2 brothers who were near the end of a list they'd spent years compiling. I told Vasquez to get his coat. I told the desk officer to send a patrol car to Mrs. Amann's address in Hyde Park immediately, not to explain, just to maintain a visual until we arrived. Then I walked fast toward the door. My hands were steady. They do that sometimes. When the urgency is high enough, the shake goes quiet. We staked out Frank Cole's Bridgeport address for 40 minutes before anything moved. The building was a 2-flat on a side street that smelled of the river and something industrial. Vasquez was in the car. I was in a doorway half a block east with a cigarette I kept forgetting to smoke. Roy Cole appeared from the north end of the street at 9:10. I recognized the walk before I recognized the face, that same precise, unhurried gait. He went directly to the front door of the 2-flat and used a key. Didn't look around. 5 minutes later, both of them appeared at the downstairs window. I had never seen them together before. I thought I was prepared for it. I wasn't. It wasn't simply that they were identical. I knew they were identical. It was the way they moved in the shared space, the small adjustments they made for each other without looking. the way one turned and the other had already begun to respond to whatever the turning meant, like a conversation conducted entirely below the level of language. 2 bodies, 1 grammar. I thought of Eleanor's words at the kitchen table, one thought between 2 bodies, and felt something that I can only describe as the sadness of being right. Vasquez appeared at my elbow. He'd seen them through the window, too. He said nothing. Sometimes the job shows you something, and the only honest response is silence. Vasquez and I moved closer. I wanted to be certain of the address before we called in support, certain enough to commit. I edged along the building wall and got to the side window, which was unlatched and open an inch despite the November cold. Through the inch of open window I heard them, not arguing, not excited, just talking in the quiet, even way that I'd heard Roy Cole talk during our interrogation. That flat, disciplined register. Frank's voice was identical. This was disorienting in a way I hadn't anticipated. I couldn't tell which was speaking without seeing the scar. I heard, "After Hyde Park, we're finished." One voice, then the other, like a second note of the same chord. "After Hyde Park." Then I saw one of them lift the leather notebook from the table, open it, turn to the back pages, run his finger down a column of names. I could see the crossed-out lines even from the window, all but one. The last name had a circle around it rather than a line through it. The circle meant it was still to come. I understood then, completely, what I'd seen in the cold open. The man at the window crossing a name from the list, not recording a death, confirming a plan. The circle was Gertrude Ammon. The notebook held the entire architecture of their grief. I looked at Vasquez. He nodded. We moved. Vasquez radioed for backup while I drove. Not a request. An instruction, with enough force in the telling that the desk officer didn't waste time with questions. 2 men, Bridgeport address, heading toward Hyde Park, armed and considered extremely dangerous. Send a second car to Gertrude Ammon's coach house. Maintain position. Do not disturb the resident. I drove hard through wet streets. The rain had come back full and steady, the kind that filled the gutters and turned headlights into smears of yellow on black asphalt. Vasquez had his service weapon checked and holstered. I kept both hands on the wheel because I needed the discipline of the grip to keep them steady. I thought about Gertrude Ammon, 81 years old, in a coach house in Hyde Park, who had no idea that a decision she'd been party to 28 years ago had been quietly constructing its consequences for a very long time. She hadn't been malicious. I was almost certain of that. She'd been a woman doing administrative work for an institution that believed it was doing right by orphaned children. She'd prepared paperwork. She'd signed documents. She hadn't thought about what it cost. Most of the damage in this world isn't done by malice. It's done by people doing their jobs without asking what the job is doing. I took the Lakeshore Drive south and hit the accelerator. They'd taken a faster route than I'd calculated, or they'd moved earlier than I'd anticipated. Either way, when Vasquez and I came down the alley behind Gertrude Ammon's coach house property, we saw them already moving through the rear garden. Not running. Walking with the same deliberate pace as always. Roy from the east side of the garden. Frank approaching the coach house door from the south. That's when I understood their method in its full operational sense. One approaches. One is visible elsewhere, building the alibi in real time if necessary. They'd refined it to a system over 5 murders. They were 2 halves of one machine, and the machine was almost at the end of its work. I shouted an identification. Both figures stopped. Both turned at exactly the same moment, and in the rain, in the dark, they were indistinguishable. Same height, same coat, same stillness. "Police, don't move!" Both of them moved, not toward us, away but not in the same direction. Roy back east through the garden into the alleyway that led toward the park. Frank breaking south toward the street. Vasquez didn't hesitate. "I'll take south," he said, and he was already running. I went east into the dark and the rain, 40 years of instinct carrying me through a garden I couldn't see clearly, following a man I'd spent 3 weeks learning.
Vasquez found Frank Cole in the alley on the south side of the property, standing between 2 brick walls with nowhere left to go. This is what Vasquez told me afterward, and I have no reason to doubt it because it fits everything I knew about Frank Cole by then. Frank didn't run. He'd turned into the alley and simply stopped, hands in his coat pockets, facing Vasquez with the same expression, or absence of expression, that Roy had worn across the interrogation table. The rain came down on both of them, and neither man moved. Vasquez had his weapon drawn. "On the ground," he said. "Hands where I see them." Frank looked at the gun with the interested calm of a man assessing something that doesn't fundamentally change his position. Then he said, "You're not going to shoot me." The voice was identical to Roy's. Vasquez said it through him for half a second. That strange auditory double, the same flat cadence. "No," Vasquez said, "but I will." Frank looked at him for another moment. Then he took his hands from his pockets, slowly, deliberately, showing them empty, and he put them above his head. He got down on the wet alley stones with the careful dignity of a man who has decided this is the moment and has made his peace with it. Vasquez cuffed him and called it in. Roy Cole made it to the park before I lost the ground advantage. He was 10 years younger than me and unhurried in a way that covered distance efficiently without looking fast. I tracked him by the sound of wet footsteps on the path and then by the creak of a metal fire escape on the far side of a building that backed up to the park's eastern edge. I came around the building's corner and looked up. Roy was on the second landing, neither climbing nor descending, just standing, looking down at me, rain on his face. He didn't move when I appeared below him. I didn't draw my weapon. I don't know exactly why. He wasn't running. He wasn't threatening. He was just standing on a fire escape in the rain, looking at me with that same still quality, and something about drawing on a stationary man felt like the wrong grammar for the moment. "Roy Cole," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "You found the photograph," he said. Not a question. The statement of a man who has arranged his facts and wants to confirm the arrangement. "I found the photograph," I said. He nodded once. Then he came down the fire escape without being asked, steadily, one rung at a time, and when he reached the ground he put his hands out in front of him. The scar on his left hand caught the distant lamplight. I cuffed him. He offered no resistance at all.
They sat side by side in the interrogation room for 4 hours. I watched them through the window for part of it. The way you watch something you need to fully believe before you can act on it. Side by side, they were extraordinary. Not in any dramatic sense, not in any way that telegraphed danger or history or the specific catastrophe they'd constructed over 3 years. They were just two men, identical, sitting in the same posture with the same stillness, and the ordinariness of it was more unsettling than anything theatrical could have been. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't need to. In 38 years, they'd apparently developed a language below language. The small adjustments, the shared geometry. Even now, cuffed to the table, when one shifted weight, the other shifted slightly in response, like two trees that have grown toward the same light. Pryor stood beside me at the window and said nothing for a long time. Then, two of them, I said, all this time, I said. He asked me who was which. I told him Roy was on the left, the scar hand. He looked at the window again, and I could see him doing what I'd done, recalibrating every assumption the case had built. After a while, he said, "Go in, Mahoney." I went in. I sent everyone out. Vasquez, the patrol officer, the stenographer who'd been waiting in the hall. Pryor started to object, and I looked at him with 40 years in my eyes, and he let it go. Just the three of us. Roy on the left, Frank on the right, and me across the table. One lamp between us, the kind that throws a circle of amber light and leaves the edges of the room in darkness. I'd done this enough times to know that the dark edges matter. They create a pressure that official light doesn't. I set my notebook on the table. I put my pen beside it. I didn't open the notebook. I didn't uncap the pen. This was not that kind of conversation. The brothers looked at me. Roy with the familiar quality, that calm appraisal, the face that gave nothing away. Frank the same, but, and this was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only catch after hours of watching, slightly different in the set of the mouth. Roy's stillness was the stillness of a man who has made his peace. Frank's stillness was the stillness of a man still holding something. I let the silence run for a while. Silence is the last honest pressure I know. You stop filling it, and people eventually feel the weight of what they haven't said. I waited. The lamp hummed. The rain had found the window again.
Frank spoke first. I noted it. Roy had been the face of this operation, the one interviewed, the one watched. Frank had been invisible. That he spoke first told me something about what this moment meant to him. We were 6 years old, he said. Quiet, no anger in it. Something worse than anger. The flat truth of a thing that happened and couldn't be undone. They split us up like furniture. Each of those families kept one of us, thought they were doing good, thought they were solving a problem. A pause. We were the problem they were solving. Roy then, picking up the cadence without a beat. We spent 15 years finding each other. When we did, we also found the list, the committee, the families, what they'd decided, and why. Frank. The older twin in each of those families had their lives intact families, the thing they took from us. Roy. We took the same thing. The symmetry of it was complete and terrible. They'd spent 15 years finding each other across a city that didn't know they existed. They'd built something out of that reunion, not just a plan, but a logic, a mirror logic. What was done to us we will do to them. Not random, not madness. Grief organized into arithmetic. I let them finish. I owed them that. Then I sat forward.
I sat forward and put my hands flat on the table. Not threatening, just present. I've listened to all of it, I said. Every name, every date, every reason. I understand the arithmetic. I understand what was done to you at 6 years old and what it cost you, and what finding each other meant after 15 years of looking. Neither of them spoke. Roy's eyes were steady. Frank's hands had tightened slightly on the table. But here is what you did, I said. Every family you touched, the Careys, the Holsts, the Bremers, all of them, you left a survivor. You left a twin, alone. You said you were answering what was done to you, but you did the same thing, exactly the same thing. You just did it with a choice instead of a committee. Roy said nothing. Frank's jaw moved once, then was still. Ruth Carey's sister Vera will carry this for the rest of her life, I said, same as you did. You didn't break the cycle. You handed it to someone else and walked away. The silence after that was different from the silences before it. Heavier. Roy looked at the table. It was the first time in the entire case I had seen Roy Cole look at anything other than directly ahead. Frank said quietly, "We know." 2 words. That was all. I believed them completely. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and went to the door. Roy and Frank Cole, sentenced to life at Stateville. The last name on their list, an elderly woman named Beatrice Marsh, 71 years old, who had served on the St. Catherine's Adoption Committee 32 years prior and had not thought about it since. She lived. She never knew how close it came. I didn't tell her. Some information protects nobody and costs everything. I walked out of the precinct at 11:30. The rain had stopped somewhere during the hours I'd been inside, and the streets had that clean, wet quality they get after a long rain in November. The smell of stone and cold air, and something almost honest about a city that spends most of its time lying. I lit a cigarette on the precinct steps. My hands were steadier than they'd been in weeks. I noted that without knowing what to make of it. I thought about the photograph. 2 boys, 6 years old, holding hands outside a stone building, before the world divided them and taught them what that division cost, before they found each other again and decided that cost required payment. I thought about Vera Carey sitting on a hallway floor, breathing without purpose. I thought about Frank saying, "We know," and meaning it. The city began its slow morning machinery around me. I smoked the cigarette down and dropped it in a puddle. I went to get my car. I drove home. The sun came up gray over the lake, the way it does in Chicago in November, without apology, without particular warmth, just present. That's enough most days. That has to be enough.